Well, hey everyone. Thanks for coming to our talk. It's always nice that somebody wants to show up. We get a little worried that that the other sessions are so exciting, we won't get to talk to anybody, so I'm really glad that you're here. For any of you who were in the last session we did, it's going to be the opposite. So last session Joe was talking and I added stuff in. This is going to be more me talking, and then I'll ask Joe to come in with examples and things. So we're going to talk a bit about decolonizing mental health. We're both psychologists. Joe's a clinical psychologist. I'm a bit different. I'm a health psychologist. So we don't always agree on everything, and sometimes we come at things from different perspectives.
Don't tell us that.
Well, our professions are different, so we do sometimes look at the same problem differently, even if we're looking at it within our own profession. So we're not necessarily saying that this is the way to look at things. We're just saying this is a way to think about things. And I think as two First Nations psychologists with some years' experience, the idea for doing this has been really out of our own experiences of what it's like to be trained and to work in what we call a mainstream colonised mental health system. So please feel free to make comments or ask questions as I go. I won't make you wait to the end, and I find that it's a bit nicer if people ask questions and things as I go, because it's more communal and collaborative, and I like that a bit better than just me standing up here just talking. So this is us. Yeah, Joe. Was anybody in my session yesterday? Who's here today? Oh, okay. So I'll go through this. Again. This is where I'm from. This is kind of the view out of my kitchen window, but I'm quite a little bit further away. But the kitchen window looks straight up this valley. And when we introduce ourselves, I did ask an elder earlier after lunch today if she'd teach me how to introduce myself in Blackfoot. But she didn't have time, so I'll learn for next time. I'll introduce myself in my own way for this. So when we introduce ourselves, we actually, our name comes last, and sometimes people don't even say their own name at all. What comes first is music. That was a good interlude. Get you to do that again. I like that. So what comes first is our tribe. A little bit of history there. I did ask people yesterday if they could work out where I was from. I did get a couple of answers. So anybody know where I'm from? New Zealand. Yep. Anybody guess which tribe? Nope. That was a trick question. I'm sorry. There isn't a Maori tribe. Maori is the name. We were never one people. We actually come originally descended from different migrations. So my people were from the last migration. So we know the name of the people on the boat that brought us there. We know the name of the captain of the boat, we know the name of the boat, and we take that very much as part of our identity. And there's quite a bit of intermarriage, much more than there used to be these days, so we're not so distinctive as we were, but there is a certain kind of look. In the last session, Joe just played a little clip of a man called Tamaiti, and he's tuhoi, and he talks about being short. And if you see Tamaiti is short and he's square, and he talks about being, his words, a short-ass tuhoi. We have a border with them, and we're actually pretty famous for not getting on, but put that aside. So Māori was the name that we adopted for ourselves when we needed to differentiate ourselves from the colonisers. And it actually just means normal. What are you? I'm a normal person. That's what Māori means. If you ask someone if someone asks for a drink and they ask for wai Māori, it means I'd like just plain water, please, because wai is water. So it means normal person. And so when we had to differentiate ourselves, and some white people came along and said, "What are you?" We said, "Well, we're the normal people." And so that is a pan-tribal identity that we never had until we had to have one to differentiate the people of our country, the different peoples of our country, from the people who came later. So there's no Māori tribe. There are quite a number of tribes. We have bands. This is more structured than it used to be. It used to be looser. Sometimes somebody would be a band, sometimes they'd call themselves a tribe. It used to shift. Not so much now. It's structured. Part of that's around government policy. So, therefore, when we talk about our identity, the first thing that we actually say is the name of our boat that brought us to this place. So in my case, it's Takatimu. So we say ko Takatimu te waka, which is Takatimu was our vessel that brought us here. That's the first thing we say as Māori people amongst ourselves when we greet anybody. At that moment, Takatimu, because Takatimu actually, a number of tribes go up to that same thing. So Kahungunu is the name of my ancestor about 500 years ago, who was well known for having lots of wives and siring lots of children and avoiding war, but having intermarriage instead. And so he had lots of offspring. We are actually the second biggest tribe. So thank you, Kahungunu. That's why I'm here. He's famous for being handsome, and he only had to look at the woman and they just fall into it, all that sort of thing. So loads of children. He even had children when he was elderly. He was still having children. So we're numerous, and this is the central part of the area that we occupy. So when we go ko Takatimu te waka, we talk about the river. So this is the river that we're connected to. It's not a matter of, when we say our river, we really mean that we belong to this body of water here. When we say our mountain, we really mean that we belong to that mountain. In English, you can't get away from saying our, but it gives the wrong kind of idea. So this is the mountain we belong to. It's called Karanaki. Big mountain standing alone. It looks lower than that peak, but that's because it's so far away. So it looks, and that's how we introduce ourselves. And then we might get down to our band, which for me is Hinimoa, Patuiaputi, Hawea, and Hori. So those are the bands that I'm descended from. And we'll talk about our marae, which is kind of like a longhouse. For me, it's two. It's a waipatu, and it's te paru. And that's how we get down to it. And when you look at this, it looks really, it looks nice. It looks beautiful. But for me, there's a two-way thing, because I know what it used to look like. And when you look in here, you see these are all our native forest is gone. Through here, these are Italian poplars. These are English willows. We can't swim fairly often in the summer. I learnt to swim in this river when I was a child, and when I was 5, I could swim bank to bank. And we just go down to the river. That's what we did. I did teach my children to swim in it, but we had to be careful because the government would come and put up signs saying, "Don't swim here, high fecal count." In other words, the farmers have been farming cows all around here, they shit in the river, and then we can't swim in it. So I know that this river is polluted, and I know what's in it. I know that our mountain here is fenced off, and if we want to go on it, we have to ask the permission of a farmer, and we're not allowed to go there when there's lambs because we might disturb the stock and so on. And so most of us actually have never been on our own mountain because it's private property. And so this land that was ours until about in the 1850s, depending on which piece, between 1851 and 1876, it's now all in someone else's hands. Chambers family own this. It is a public park up there. but it's not ours. We had one little aside. There's a winery down here. People like to come and pretend they're in Italy, and they put in grapevines, and they have all the tourists come in and things, and they're wealthy families here. And they decided that it would be a good idea to put a walking track. There's a limestone. We had burial caves back behind it. We put a walking track in up the side of the back there, and it was this horrible white zigzagging scar that went up. And of course we protested. It was appalling. It was an appalling scar on our land, and it created this argument in the local community. And so we went down and protested at the bottom and asked people not to go up the path, please. And then we had all these people in Lycra jogging around and ignoring us and going on up that path because they weren't going to be told what to do by a bunch of natives. But eventually we won, and we made the council backtrack. We got an agreement that the path would be covered over. It cost a lot too. And we got there, but it showed the racism that is always bubbling under the surface. My mother at the time was, I won't say the name, part of a local community group, and she heard all the really racist things that were being said about Māori saying, well, excuse me, you can't do this to this sacred land. So anyway, I'll move on. That's me. So this is a presentation outline. This is what we'll be talking about. I'm going to talk firstly, and for those, does people work in mental health? Any of you psychologists or mental health workers? Or yep, okay. So you'll be well versed in this kind of thing. The creation and erasure of other in mental health theory and practice, and I think we'll all be familiar with that. And we'll talk about decolonizing diagnosis and treatment. I'll give you some examples around that, challenging Eurocentric models of mental health. If we've been, any of you been to university and learnt mental health stuff there, you would know that basically this is what you're taught. And we're going to talk about healing and resistance, and we're going to use, we've got 3 case studies there to actually talk about clients that have come in with these problems and using traditional Indigenous ways to understand what's going on for them and to work with them for change. So, Joe, jump on. Creation of other. I won't spend too much. I'll just pick out the important things on here. Well, I guess it's all, but I'll pick out the main points. Features of colonial systems. And as colonised people, we're all well acquainted with these. What have we all had? Ideologically driven, the assumed superiority, you know, again, the idea of the defective native who's simply not as good, not as smart, not as so-called civilized, all those kind of things. You know, the childlike, incompetent native, which is just an excuse to take our stuff. You know, let's just be real about this. We had lots of stuff that someone else has wanted, and along comes someone to make up an excuse of why it's okay to grab it and push us off our land. Military force and political coercion, you know, we've been through that. It's interesting in my country how the wars that happened, you know, I notice in the US there's more awareness of the wars that happened. In my country, there isn't. It's almost this great amnesia of what happened with the wars that we fought. People are, I mean, we had wars that were called the New Zealand Civil Wars. Nobody knows. Most New Zealanders don't know there was ever that kind of war. They have no knowledge of that. I know the American Civil War is a very big deal here, but that was a different kind of fight. But you know, for us, New Zealand Civil War, which was essentially Māori fighting for our rights, our land, our resources, we fought different tribes up and down the country for a very long time, generations long. We fought against the British, waged war campaigns, had battles, shot each other up. But most New Zealanders don't know that it ever happened. It's completely not there. And our word for the war was te pukuriri pāha, which is the white man's anger. That's our word for those set of wars. And I think it's I think it's really fitting to call those wars, because when we say war, it doesn't really tell you what was going on, but the white man's anger, that tells you quite a bit more about what was going on. The imposition of control, here's your new legal system, here's your new health system, here's your new knowledge system, and here's how you have to be if you're going to be okay in the world. Disruption of traditional systems, we had those. Assimilation. I think for us it was less forced assimilation than here, but assimilation nevertheless. I mean, my grandfather was a very, very intelligent man. He was a native speaker. And he spoke better native language than I do. He spoke better English than I do. He was an amazing man. But he said to me, don't learn the language. It's a dead language. Don't waste your time. And it's a man who was so clever and so traditionally raised. But he said that to me, and I know why, because he wanted me to have a good life. And for him, who had been beaten at school, who had been ground under with racism all his life, he didn't want that for me. So he wanted me to not learn the language. And I think he didn't really want me to be part of that world. And I can understand why. Because if I had been through what he had been through, I might think the same. No one wants their children to be hurt. No one wants their kids to have to go through racism or to be made to feel different and not as good as. So that was his advice. And many people of that generation had the same advice for their children. So we lost our language almost completely. It's coming back now. We're losing our native speakers, but we have a resurgence of young people learning, which is good. The language has changed. I'm better with our classical language. The language I spoke in 1850, I can understand that a lot better. Modern language I have trouble with because it's so full of nouns, and our traditional language isn't. So it takes me a while to adjust. And oppressive systems, norms and cultural values of the dominant culture are imposed on others, and we have that in every First Nations people have this. You simply aren't as good as the white man in whatever aspect of your life, and that's been the message. Joe? I came across this, and I don't know this person. I know he's American, from here, called Ta-Nehisi Coates. I don't know what else he said, if he said anything controversial or things that he might have said stuff I don't agree with, but I thought this was a very interesting, I just came across this quote. I thought, he said, and I think the point here was that race is the child of racism, not the father. In other words, thinking in racist ways causes you to see things by race. I thought, oh, that's interesting, okay. The process of naming the people has never been a matter of genealogy or physiognomy so much as one of hierarchy. The difference in hue and hair is old, but the belief in the preeminence of hue and hair, that the notion that these factors can correctly organise a society and that they signify deeper attributes which are indelible, this is a new idea. So what he's saying there is that, and I think in modern terms, this idea of race is actually become something that is about organising people into a social structure with certain people who are better than others. And another feature of colonised societies, is a bit like a pyramid, or shall we say a mountain, kind of pale on top and browner as you get to the bottom. I know our mountains look like that. And then if you look at our government and a whole lot of other things, you see the same thing. But I thought that was an interesting idea. I'll keep thinking on it. So we get to the mental health part, and I'll join it all up. You'll know Maria Yellow Horse Braveheart's work, which is wonderful, groundbreaking work. I know it created this wave of interest around the world in Indigenous peoples when that came out. Historical trauma is an interesting one. I want to emphasise here that the message around historical trauma isn't that we are somehow born defective because of what happened to us in the past. And unfortunately, sometimes there's some talk around historical trauma that kind of gives that impression. So that's not where I'm going with that. It's about acknowledging the past, about understanding why we're here, how we got here, what are the factors that shaped us. We see reductions in resilience. That's a polite way of putting it. Barriers to the practice of natural wellness behaviours, and I think out of any of these, this is one that we don't talk about that much. Certainly in my work and my personal experience and the research that I've done, people have these natural wellness behaviours, and health system as it is tends to actually stop those from occurring. I mean, if you think about what you naturally do to be well, it's probably not what the government thinks you should be doing to be well. And I've never found that those two tended to match up. There's the top-down idea of what makes you well, and then there's the bottom grassroots idea of what makes you well, and that actually is what makes you well. So the barriers to natural wellness behaviours, and I'll just throw this in already because we're talking about mental health and decolonisation, is that, I don't know, as a practicing psychologist, what I was taught, graduate school and things, about wellness didn't look anything like what the people I work with think about and feel and experience as wellness. It was completely different. I'm currently more in the management side of things. I'm not practicing, although I do support Joe in his work. But when did you last do CBT, Joe? Do you know?
About 30 years ago.
Okay, Joe did CBT. I did CBT maybe 20 years ago. Last time I did CBT. Look, some people like it and they find it useful. I found Indigenous populations is not particularly useful, because I found actually that what's good for Native people is actually good for everybody. It was not surprising if you think about it, but it is. If you listen to someone, if you put yourself in their mind, if you understand their values and their principles and their traditions and their ways, how can that not be good for them, whoever they are? Self-image, racism, poverty, marginalisation, inequity, and one of the quotes I did yesterday, I'll do it again today, was Stephen Biko, who was a political activist in South Africa during the apartheid era. He was beaten to death by police in the late 70s. And I'm paraphrasing here, but what he said was that when the language that you speak, when the games that you play, when the music that you listen to and the songs that you sing, when they're all that of the white man, and that's all the white man's culture, you start to feel that there's something about your culture that isn't as good. It's this implied message. It's not as good. This is better. And there's only a small and unfortunate step from there. There's something to do with my culture that's not as good. There's something to do with me that's not as good. And that's something to do with being a First Nations person. And I've seen that a lot in my work in mental health. This idea, there's something about me that's not as good, especially working with young people, often young men, talking, these feelings come out about being inadequate and wanting to take on mainstream culture to feel okay, to get respect, to get, I guess I'll leave it at respect. Okay, thank you. So other, And of course we have the other in psychology. It's sort of the unspoken other. This is psychology, which is in large from a Western culture. I'll just add in there, I'm not wholly comfortable with using the idea of the term Western. It's like I'm not that comfortable with using the term Western knowledge or Western science, because there's a lot, it's kind of, in itself, it's reductionist. It's this idea that there is this West, and that the West, there's a science that comes out of the West and it looks like this. And we had Rene Descartes and his dualism and the positivism and the Age of Enlightenment. It all comes through this nice thing called Western science, and it's not anywhere near as rich as how it actually is. And if you look amongst the indigenous cultures and what we think of as the West, we actually see a lot of affinity with Native peoples. It's there, but we don't really hear about it. We have people like, we had Heidegger in Germany who talked about das Ein, and he talked about the fourfold of being, and that was the oneness of the person and the land and the spiritual. You had Arne Naess out of Norway with his ideas about ecoposophy, that the human is not the main part of the environment, that we're all part of the environment, it's all interrelated. Architects like Debussy talked about, cities need to have green spaces and light, because the original human home was in nature, and if we divorce ourselves from nature, we're making unwell places. Well, I can relate to all that. So, just as a respect for Western knowledge systems, so I'll say Western culture, but you know what I mean. It's a kind of a word we bandy around when we really kind of probably talking about colonizing cultures, or we're talking about the specific type. So how much of psychology or mental health actually does cross-cultural applicability? Not much. And when it does, you might get something like, the BDI, the Beck Depression Inventory, and you give it out a bunch of, First Nations people somewhere, and you do another thing, and you say, the scores look kind of the same, therefore this is valid. Well, hold up. Why is it valid just because the numbers look kind of the same? That's a kind of validity, but it's a very narrow kind of validity. Is the concept valid? Is this valid in terms of our philosophies, our beliefs, our traditional ways? Is this actually valid to shove us, to put to place? I'll try and detune my emotive language, be professional. Could say something else too. To put this in front of a Native person and say, can you fill out the Beck Depression Inventory, please? And yes, you look depressed. Is that consistent with being a Native person? I don't know. I have my doubts, actually. So we get... Oh, yeah.
So, I understand the importance of having cross-cultural, critiques on different fields and practice as a clinical psychologist, but there's a lot that's useful. Especially like when you're talking about dialectical behavior therapy and people who are suicidal, and the stress tolerance and acceptance, and a lot of cognitive behavioral therapy is really very helpful to people. And I don't think it's really responsible for us to say really blanket terms, especially with people from here who don't have access to basic mental health care. I get what you're saying, but I just have to, I can't just sit and say nothing. Because I do need to, as a Native person, these things have helped me. These things have helped my family. And when I teach them and when I help people have access to them, it's helpful to them. So, I understand what you're saying, but I just wanted to just preface that a little. Yeah,
totally. No, thanks for putting that in. Okay. I think we'll probably get a bit clearer when we get through. So I'm trying not to say that these are bad, because actually that's not the impression. I'm not saying that these are useless. So thanks for bringing that up in case I'm giving that message. I think sometimes I've spent so many years fighting the system that it comes across a bit more negatively than what I actually mean. But sometimes these things are useful for people, so I'm not saying you know, that don't do CBT, or that this is not as good or it's not helpful. I'm just saying there's a way of looking at these things, and there is a way of doing things differently. And some of those ways are more in line with our traditional practice than others. So. And we have studies which show a lack of cross-cultural applicability tend to be ignored. I've certainly seen that. I know with attachment theory, there's quite a number of cross-cultural studies that don't support attachment theory. But they tend not to be talked about. And it's an interesting phenomena of, it happened at home, people coming in and telling people all about attachment theory, and then people relating to that and thinking about parenting in that ways. But it's a interesting cycle we get into. When we're told how to put something into a framework, we start seeing things through that framework. And we have had that with what is described as a Māori model of health that actually came from the United Nations in 1946. Most of the structure of it came. We would say there's parts to wellness, emotional, physical and social, which was adapted from a guy called Bernson. It was a little bit earlier. So that was adopted. We had spirituality added, and that was told to us as that's a Māori model of health. And I was always I didn't know about where it had come from, but I always thought, that doesn't look like a Māori model of health to me. It looks like kind of European thinking with these bits and emphasising this amount, and that you need to be this much and not that much. That says very, very European thinking to me. And so I looked into it and I found out that's actually where the structure came from. But in my research, when I went out and asked about wellness, anybody who had been exposed to that model talked about Māori wellness in those terms, because I'd seen the model and they found it as a way to express themselves. And that model has actually been really useful. I used it myself, working with people, talking about the emotional aspects and the spiritual aspects. Is it a Māori model? No. And when we take it on board, we lose our traditional thinking around our own models of health and actually take on another one. And I'm not saying that's good or bad, but I noticed very strongly that's what had happened. Because when I talked to old people, or pretty much anybody who hadn't seen that model, who hadn't been told that there are different aspects to health, and some of it is psychological and some of it is physical, they didn't think that way. It was not even a suggestion. It was completely different.
It's really interesting because that you're talking about that, because actually we just came from doing a presentation on honoring cross-cultural paradigms, and that's something that I think is really important for us, especially at a tribal or an Indigenous research conference, is to make sure that we're saying, those ways are privileged, those ways have been privileged, and we almost forget that we had our own ways at one time to do all of this healing that didn't include anything to do with the Western or whatever we want to call it. But I do appreciate what you're saying about there are aspects of Western culture that everybody in the whole world that was at one time Indigenous people. And so I really appreciate your examples you brought out from the Norwegian and the German, because they all had Indigenous roots too, and they all have their own ways that worked for them, and we have our own ways that work for us here. And so I think that what you're saying is so important, that we open our minds to also realize that we have our own ways, and we can't be afraid to embrace that will work for our people.
I think it's to have the choice. Is what I'm getting at here. It's the recognition and the choice. And if somebody wants to use that, what we're calling the Māori model health, that kind of isn't Māori, and they're finding it good with their clients, I've used it. It's helpful. It's changed our health system quite a bit, because it's made, especially people in biomedical fields, actually made them think about other things and talk about other things with their people. But it's the consciousness behind it. Yeah, I'll use this. I understand where it comes from, but I think this is going to be helpful for my clients, so I'm going to use it. And that's, that's all right, but it's having the consciousness to know that there is this, it can be helpful, but there might be something else too, another way of looking at things. So Joe. Joe, here you go, you can have a talk about that. What are some major theories in psychology and which of these are invalid to Indigenous peoples? This is there is no direct answer to this. I just like to throw this in. Yeah, Joe.
Major.
Give it to Joe.
Oh, there's heaps of theories out there. There's existentialism, humanism, behavioralism, cognitive behavioralism. And each one seeks to describe what happens and what it means. One of my great learning experiences with this was with Carolyn Barkus when we were, and Damien McShane when I was in graduate school, because Damien brought out old tapes of Fritz Perls, was a humanistic fella, Rogers, a couple of other great therapists, Mnuchin, and he said, look at these tapes of what these guys are doing. And he said, then, when you look at Rogers, describe him in terms of pearls. When you look at pearls, describe him in terms of existentialism. And I found that you could do that. So it's just, it was a matter of interpretation and of lens. We see what we're taught to see through the lenses that we're given to see things through. So these theories come out of history and they come out of brilliant thinkers. And which of these are valid to Indigenous peoples? Well, they're all valid to Indigenous peoples to the extent that we put the lens of indigeneity on and look at our people and know that as we are applying a theory, we are taking that piece and doing our best with that piece of work from the viewpoint of our beliefs, our values, and our practices. And that brings us back as providers to having to learn those values, beliefs, and practices. So how do you create your lens? Do you create it at the School of Good Works, or do you create it at the Sweat Lodge and at the Vision Quest out in the hills? And if you have a lens like that, then you can pick up cognitive behavioral, you can pick up existentialism, and you can say, these will be helpful, but they need to be helpful within the context of good, solid Indigenous thinking.
Thank you, Joe. I think something I mentioned yesterday was about, your method is a tool. It's the tool that you use for the work that you do. And something I said yesterday was, if I could, I was trying to think of an analogy, and I said, from back home, carving is a big carving. Everything was carved. Every everyday object, everything had a pattern. There's artworks was actually part of the way we lived. And so if I were to pick up an English chisel, I'm not a carver myself actually, but if I pick up an English chisel and I do a traditional carving with it, I haven't made an English carving. I've made an Indigenous carving. I just happened to use an English tool because it was a tool that was right for that particular job. And I'm not saying that the Indigenous tool was wrong or whatever, that was my choice. And I guess that's what I want to emphasize, is a choice to use. So an awareness of what you're using, what tools you're putting your hand to, and making sure that you have a whole suite of tools. Might be outside of what you learned you've learned in education. But as Joe was saying, it's the thinking behind this, the Indigenous worldview. It's the knowledge systems, the context, the traditions that are actually going to be the driver for whatever tool that you pick up. And you can pick up an Indigenous tool. I can pick up a traditional mallet and a traditional chisel. And I can make myself a lovely English carving, or I can make myself I can make myself something out of Walt Disney. I can make myself Mickey Mouse. Is that an indigenous carving? Well, no, it's not. I might have used the indigenous tool, but I didn't make an indigenous thing, because what was driving it was not an indigenous way. It was something from another culture. So it goes both ways. Joe, you want to think?
So is that like when the Blackfoot singers sing about Mickey Mouse?
He showed me that on YouTube the other way. No, my daughter found it. She said, "Oh, look at this. It's such a laugh." I looked at it and, sure. Why not? It's funny. So this is a bit about, I spoke for about an hour and a half on this yesterday, so this is just one slide on it. About the knowledge process, and it's really just supporting what I was saying earlier. Key questions really, what is there to know? I've got being, becoming, and reality, and indigenous philosophy and principles. So what is the world? How was it made? How was reality constructed? How do you think reality is constructed? If you're working with a client, what is the reality that you construct together? Because those are all the things that, when you come in and you're working with people, that healing space is what you create between the two of you. So what you bring to it is just as important as what they bring. It's a partnership. So know what there is to know. I used one of the examples I use is, if you only know what you know and you don't ever wonder what else there is to know, you only ever go along quite a narrow track, and you won't have the suite of tools that I was talking about. You might just have one chisel. It might just be the English chisel, who knows? If you question what is there to know, if you ask the old people what is there to know, you sit and you listen to them about how the world works, what's in it, how people are, how relationships work, then you know more. And if you don't know that there's something else to know, you're never going to know that, you're never going to question it, you're never going to find out about it because you don't see it. And it's of interest to me how peoples around the world have looked at the universe and actually come up with some similar kind of things about the way the world works. Although one of the features of colonized peoples is that a lot of our ideas about the way the world works have been ignored. Fairly often we had missionaries come in, and missionaries who were very grounded in the Bible. So biblical story was very much part of their world. So when they wrote about us, they would tend to write our stories in a kind of a biblical format. And that was, I don't actually think that was on purpose. Well, some of it might, but I think it was more that they just didn't know what they were looking at. They couldn't see beyond what their own worldview was. And so when they looked at ours, all they could do was slot it into what they knew. We had a situation where I come from where our myths and legends, for want of a better term, our stories were rewritten to emphasize the male hero, because that actually was, in terms of the colonizing culture, it was the symbol of power in the colonizing culture was the male, and specifically the socially powerful male. So there's plenty of stories about the socially powerful male, the chief's son, all that sorts of thing, and his heroic deeds, which is fine, but the women's stories were ignored. And I don't think it was because they thought as women's stories not important. I don't think it even got to that, and I'm just guessing, I don't know, to that amount of, it was just, they didn't see it. Didn't see it as important, didn't come down. So we're trying to revitalize women's stories because of what was lost. We're trying to revitalize our views of the universe because that was ignored. So, people might know, people at home, they might know about Stephen Hawking and his brief history of time. In the 1980s, we talked about the singularity. You might think of as a priest, philosopher, scientist. I think he was in the 20s, called Lemaitre. He was French. And he talked about the Big Bang and the way the universe is expanding, and he talked about universal energy. Actually, I can relate to some of that. But all of our stuff got lost because Stephen Hawking was much more important than anything we had to say. So we're trying to revitalise that. But I guess I'm getting on a thing, but what I'm trying to say here is know who you are and know how you think the universe works and embrace it. You know, the idea of the uninvolved clinician who works as if they're a blank slate, that's not really true. You know, we're all people, we all have relationships, we have a therapeutic relationship between us. The disinterested, the unbiased clinician is not actually really a thing. We all have our own ways of looking at the world. What's valuable to know? I've got prioritise the legitimacy and validity of Indigenous knowledge systems, and that's been hard in psychology, I have to say. Prioritising Indigenous knowledge systems is very difficult when you're trained through a system that doesn't. I teach in the course that I did 20 years ago. And when I went through, there wasn't any cultural components at all. And then some things happened, and they realised that there was no cultural component, and it brought people like me in to teach a cultural component. But I get a day, a year with the students, and I try and pack it full. And this year, for the first time, we actually had it on in a traditional setting. Wasn't quite the first time, but the way we did it, I think, was the first time we got to do that. But still, that's all I get. And I think they get a little bit more. There's now, they're adding more in the time, but 95% of the coursework isn't us. And what do we want to know? And that's actually a deeper question than what it sounds like. What do we really want to know? What do we really want to know about somebody? Do we really want to know what's wrong with them? What other things could we be asking? Well, maybe we could be asking what's right with them. Because what often happens with Indigenous people is we're told all about what's wrong with us. Bad parents and, crazy. I had a man come in. He's actually a case study later on, and I said, after about 3 sessions, when he got to trust me, and I said, so what did you think when you first got referred to me? I used to work in a hospital. And he said, well, I come in here and they're always telling me there's something wrong with my body. And then when I got a referral to you, I thought, shit, there's something wrong with my head as well. And he was kind of right. That actually was what they were saying. That wasn't an incorrect viewpoint. But that's the thing. That's how he was feeling going through the system. Was there was just always something wrong with him. It was his head. It was his body. It was, So he was quite a disempowered person by the time he got to me. So I have a little case study about him. So this is something. Just to put the thoughts in your head right now. It's about reimagining the field of mental health as a discipline that truly and equitably includes diverse voices, experiences, and cultural context. So just have a little think for your own thoughts on that. I mean, it's something we could talk about for an hour as a group, but this is not really what our talk is about. But I think it's just worth it taking a minute to just imagine what that might look like. And I know when I first started as a psychologist, what I was doing doesn't look anything like what I imagine it would look like. It's getting there slowly, working with universities around the coursework and things like that, but it still doesn't look like how I imagine it in my head. And that's hope. And hope drives a lot of work, I've found. If you have hope, there's always the possibility of change. And when you give up hope, likelihood of change goes down. So it's about hope. Session 2, this is a shorter bit, and then we'll get on to the case studies. As it says, decolonizing diagnosis and treatment, Joe. It's about challenging the status quo. So I do find sometimes that current models will pathologize, and we'll talk about this more in our case studies, that sometimes when you see a traditional person and they appear to be, and this is interesting, they appear to be maybe psychotic, they appear to be maybe depressed, they meet all the DSM criteria, they actually, there's other ways of looking at that. And to say this person is psychotic and they need to go off to a specialist psychiatrist, or this person is depressed and they need to be this, sometimes misses it. It's that thing of, what don't you know? What is there to know about this person? What is there to know about the history that shaped them, the culture that they've grown up in? What is there to know about that might tell you something else about what's going on for them? I'll get to the rest of the case study. These are just from this is my work, really, in my research and reading and talking with other Indigenous psychologists about key concepts of the kind of stuff that we do. I found connection so important. In my experience, somebody who's disconnected finds it very hard to get well. That connection is supported, then amazing things can happen. I talked a bit about the natural wellness seeking behaviours earlier. How do they think about getting well? I know at home, the community I'm in, for Māori, wellness is very active. It's kind of unusual to ask a Māori person about how do they be well if they're not feeling so good, what do they do? And for them to say, I'll put on some nice music and some nice smells in the house and I lie down or I have a meditation. You don't hear that. They say, I go out and I walk in the forest. They go, I go for a swim in my river. If something is really, really hurting, they might spend 3 days getting across all the way down. It's a long, thin country. There's islands, there's ferries you have to catch. They might spend days crossing mountains to get to their own river so they can go in it for that emotional pain. Local river won't cut it, and they know in their heart what they need, and they might do that. And they might actually go into the water and sit under the water, completely immerse themselves, and just feel the river washing away that horrible emotional pain that they're under. And there's not another river that's going to do it for them. Might be someone from the south. My river's not going to help that. The pain's that bad, so they go home. So that's what I mean when I say natural wellness behaviour. What is it that people in their hearts that want to do when they're feeling distressed, when they're feeling upset? And so I said, it's where I come from. Nobody's lying on bed listening to music and having a yoga session or whatever. Yoga's pretty good, but the natural. They want to get out. They want to get into their river. They want to go down to some of them want to go down to the sea, and there's a lot of immersion. They want to get into the water, get into the river, go into the sea, sit and smell the smells of nature, the soil and the trees, because there's a positive energy that you can absorb and become well. And I've seen that many times. People who might otherwise have gone on the kind of the other route of maybe some antidepressants and some traditional psychology type therapy. Other things work as well. And expression of traditional values, whatever they are, kindness, generosity, caring, guardianship, wisdom, all those kind of things. One thing I didn't put in there, but I know from home, is interrelatedness is really important. Can't miss that if you're doing psychology with people at home, because that's a key thing. Even if we see someone, I think Joe and I are working with a young man with addictions at the moment, and I think the first hour, Joe complained about the leak. Session was 6.5 hours long for our intake session, our evaluation. And I was talking first with the guy's mum, And then we're talking, I said, well, he was sort of off somewhere and he didn't really want to come in and talk to us. Well, that's all right, he doesn't need to. We'll talk with you. And so explain our ancestry and all that sort of thing. So we knew who each other were, kind of like the picture I showed you in the beginning. And then his son comes in, kind of curious, what are these psychologists doing? And she says, tell my son about where you're from. First thing she said. And that was the interrelatedness. That was the basis for all the therapy that we were going to do with that family, was everybody's connections to their lands. And that's actually where it came from. So yeah, Joe did complain about the length. And then the next time was about another 5 or 6 hours, and there might have been another 5 hours after that. These are weekly sessions, but there's a lot of improvement happening in that family, coming from the most serious depths of addiction and problems. So, key messages: seeing things from more than one perspective and being able to explain the situation using alternative viewpoints. Know what you don't know. What is there to know? Ask yourself that fundamental question. What could I know about this situation? I know what I know, but what else is there? Could I ask somebody? I think working in a mainstream system is really important that you can do this, because mainstream systems, generally speaking, you usually have to have a mainstream explanation for everything. You can have two. Nothing wrong with having two explanations and two ways of looking at things. Okay, so we're up. We've got the case studies coming up. I'll do one, and Joe's got a couple of neat ones. I've talked about that. Writing Indigenous ways. It's a bit use an alternative lens, and you can sit down and you can say to yourself, well, according to the DSM, this person has depression, might have some psychosis. That's what might be going on for them. And I say, well, according to my traditions, this person is disconnected from his land. He's disconnected from his traditions. The energy of his people and his environment isn't coming into him, so he's feeling this negativity. This is pushing him into a kind of a thinking in the other world, and this is giving him what looks like some psychosis. Now, I'm not saying either of those are right or wrong, but there's two ways to explain that man's behaviour. And I know which one sometimes the bosses want to see. And that's okay, it's okay. But what we can find within our own cultures. I'm a big fan of traditional activities, I really am. I make programs for people who've had addictions and have suffered quite severe brain damage. I'm a big promoter of traditional activities for healing brain damage. I'll give an example. Weaving is a big deal, and I'm making fiddly things is a big deal at home. It's a key craft. And say when you're weaving something, you have to remember a pattern. You have to do a repetitive movement. You have to get into a rhythm of doing it. We just fall into a rhythm. Actually, it's kind of what happens. It's almost hypnotic. And there's the other things around that. There's the smell of the materials. There's the touch on your fingers. There's the coordination with your arms, and a lot of brain damages from the kind of stuff I work with. People have their brain damage means that they've lost the ability to coordinate their thoughts around something. Weaving is brilliant for all that, and it's also gentle. And so we've got all that nice stuff there, but we've also got a connection with traditional activities. We've got the reconnection with the people. I spoke to a young woman who'd been having a lot of addiction problems and things, and she said, well, weaving saved my life. And she'd come down to the women's circle where they would do weaving, and she had started weaving, and that was what brought her mental health up. because there was a connection, there was intergenerational knowledge transmission, there was absorbing the healthy energy of the group into yourself to replace the negative and destructive energies that had been there. And so we see healing from brain damage from that. We see social healing. We see relationships getting better. So any traditional activity is good for all those reasons. But you find a lot of traditional craft work does involve the same kind of thing, and it's multimodal. Better than sitting and just watching something, because your whole body and your senses are learning to reintegrate. One of the things, for example, if you've been on methamphetamine, you'll have a kind of a disintegration of what's been going on, because it's the way that the dopamine systems have been affecting the brain circuits. Anchoring to place and space, I'll just add that in. Going fishing with his grandmother, going fishing again to the spot where he used to fish with his grandmother. Place and space anchoring. That's the technical term. PTSD and things quite responsive to this kind of thing. Past, present, family and children, future, hope. People who have hope don't kill themselves, generally speaking. It's when the hope is gone. Because if you have hope, you have a belief that one day something's going to be better for you. You're quite unlikely to kill yourself at that point, because the hope's there. When the hope goes, you are much more likely to kill yourself, because you don't believe that your life's ever going to be better. You don't believe you're ever going to feel better, that your relationships are going to be better. So hope, I think, is something really important to think about. Does this person have hope? Traditional pursuits, connection to others. Where I'm from, the natural world is really connecting with the natural world is the number one healing process, whether you are taking the natural plants into your body, whether you're immersing yourself in the water, whether you're walking through the forest. The idea is that they have this powerful healing energy, and that comes into you when you're absorbed, when you're immersed in it. You've got to be in it, literally in it. Or the plants have to be in you to give, your medicinal plants will give you the energy, and you take that into your body, and your body uses that as building blocks, healthy building blocks. Hopefully that was useful for you somehow. But I think of a last point here, don't be afraid, because I've been there, that case study, don't be afraid to do something that seems a bit different from what you've learnt. You listen to your heart, and don't be afraid to try something that might not look like what someone else would do. Yeah. I had a very interesting bit of research I did around wellness. I talked to quite a lot of research around wellness, but I talked to a range of the most different people I could find. And I talked to elders who'd grown up in traditional environments, and I talked to young people who'd only ever known the city and didn't really know anything about their own backgrounds. And what really came across to me is that when you talked to them for a while, you started to see similarities in thinking that you might not, if you just talked to them for a bit, you wouldn't have picked it. But after a while, and you really, you look under the layers and you talk to someone about wellness, what was really fascinating to me was sort of some young woman who'd grown up within a gang culture, who was completely disenfranchised, told me a very similar thing about wellness to an elder who was in his 80s, and that they had such different lives. And so I took that to mean that underneath everything, underneath the colonisation and the disconnection, that seed of Indigenous thinking is still there. You just, you talk to someone enough, it comes out. That surprised me, actually. It taught me a bit of a lesson, because you wouldn't have thought, this young woman had every reason to be disenfranchised. The kind of culture that she'd grown up as, it was a gang culture. The urban diaspora in the state housing and that sort of thing. But after a while, you could still find the native ways of thinking under all that, and probably no one had taught her. It was just something in her that she'd come to. So.